The war in Ukraine has put a fragile global trade recovery at risk. The World Trade Organization says the world economy is going to suffer severe consequences and poorer countries would be particularly impacted.
Supply chain bottlenecks that started in the pandemic, further disruption due to Russia's invasion and soaring energy prices all continue to affect global trade growth. Our correspondent Juliet Mann has more. Juliet.
Thanks, Jamie and Robin. And I know John was talking about how inflation wasn't something the markets worried about a year ago. Well, they do now. The global economy is at a critical juncture. Trade wars, COVID, threadbare logistics networks, the spillover effect of the war and sanctions imposed on Russia, all are keeping investors up at night and are stopping trade in its tracks. Is it any wonder then that the WTO has slashed its growth forecasts? Now, the organisation previously predicted merchandise trade growth volume to grow at 4.7%, but they've revised it down to just 3% this year and to 3.4% next year. And just to give you an idea of how weak those numbers are, look at what happened last year. The volume of trading goods rose 3 times as much, almost 10% in 2021 to $22.4 trillion. The outlook for world GDP is also less optimistic, expected to rise 2.8% after rising 5.7% last year. WTO boss Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala warned of a potential food crisis because of disruptions to exports from Ukraine and Russia.
We need to act and act decisively on this issue of food in order to avoid food riots, as the like of which we began to experience in 2008-2009 food crisis. And we're already seeing in some countries now, you see demonstrations in Sri Lanka, in different countries all over the world.
Services trade will also be affected by the war, notably in the transport and logistics sectors. Things like shipping pallets made of Russian nails and wood from Belarus and Ukraine are becoming scarce all around Europe, and that's led to production halts and component shortages for companies all over the world. Well, Coleman is senior economist at the World Trade Organization.
Well, not in a spiraling global crisis, because we still have a forecast for trade growing and global GDP growing in 2022, but the pace of growth has slowed substantially, at least as far as our perspective is concerned.
Commodities have been badly affected, but some manufactured goods have had steadier growth, haven't they? Talk us through.
Well, there has been a gradual recovery in some of the sectors that were affected by supply chain hiccups last year. You had shortages of semiconductors that were reducing output of automobiles, and also backups in ports, particularly in the west coast of the United States. And these issues were gradually being worked out. You saw increasing container throughput in U.S. ports at the start of the year here. You also had increased trade in semiconductors. And so while delivery times were still long and shipping rates were still high, things were moving in a better direction. But now this conflict risks exacerbating these pre-existing problems.
Which parts of the world, which countries are going to be most affected by this turmoil?
Well, the immediate impact, of course, is going to be in Ukraine and also in Russia. But the largest trading partner of both of these countries is Europe. So we would expect to see higher prices for commodities. But also a number of countries, particularly in the area of foodstuffs, are highly dependent on exports from both Russia and Ukraine. Particularly in the Middle East and Africa, a number of countries import more than half of their grain from wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Also, there are knock-on effects potentially in certain manufacturing sectors. So, for example, Russia is the world's largest exporter of palladium, which is used in automobile manufacturing to make catalytic converters. And a number of countries like Korea, United States, Canada, Italy, these countries import 40 to 50% of their palladium from Russia. And to the extent that this might be interrupted by the conflict, at least it's threatening the automobile sector again, just when it was recovering from some of the supply issues that it was facing last year.
Do you think that the supply chain issues have caused a splintering of global trade? And what are the dangers, perhaps, of there being rival systems?
I don't think that the supply chain issues have done that. Of course, there are constraints in various places and that have caused companies to rethink some of their strategies. They may choose to hold larger inventories than they had in the past, or do some limited reshoring. But we don't see a real retrenchment from globalization. We may see some anecdotal examples of businesses reshoring manufacturing, but for the most part, globalization remains in place. But the geopolitical concerns as a result of the crisis might lead to geopolitical issues becoming a determining factor in trade. And also, with the food crisis, many countries may be tempted to impose export restrictions to secure their own food supplies. But this could just exacerbate the global situation, leaving the poorest countries just having to make do with less.